Have you ever had the feeling of being at a party full of people, hearing conversations and laughter around you, but feeling completely isolated, as if you were watching everything through glass? Have you ever noticed that the more you grow intellectually and emotionally, the harder it becomes to find someone who truly understands your deepest concerns? This is the peculiar loneliness of those who go too far in a society that settles for the superficial, the loneliness of those who, as Albert Camus said, dared to look directly at the absurd of existence while most prefer the closed curtains of illusion. This is not just a reflection on social isolation, but on the existential price we pay when our consciousness expands beyond the comfortable limits of common sense. The loneliness of those who go too far begins, almost always, with an insatiable thirst to understand. While median society satisfies itself with ready-made answers, with explanations that work only on the surface, some people feel an almost physical need to dig deeper, to question not only the answers, but the very questions that shape their lives. It's as if these people were archaeologists of existence, digging layer after layer of meaning until they reach the point where comfortable certainties disintegrate, and what remains is a disconcerting vastness of possibilities and voids. Camus understood this journey better than anyone, because he himself traveled it, when he recognized that our desperate search for meaning constantly collides with the apparent indifference of the universe. Imagine a person who gradually begins to perceive that everyday conversations no longer fulfill them. It's not arrogance or superiority, it's genuine hunger for authentic connection. When everyone around discusses the weather, the latest happenings on social media, or repeats opinions they heard somewhere without ever having truly examined them, this person feels as if they were trying to feed themselves with vapor. There's apparent substance, movement, even warmth, but nothing that truly nourishes their deep need for understanding and real connection. This is where a specific loneliness is born. Not the loneliness of those who are physically isolated, but the loneliness of those who are emotionally and intellectually orphaned in the midst of the crowd. This loneliness intensifies when we realize that our way of seeing the world has begun to distance itself radically from what society considers normal or desirable. While the majority seeks to accumulate external achievements, status, social recognition, those who go too far in the journey of self-knowledge often discover that these goals, while not necessarily empty, are insufficient to answer the fundamental questions that began to bubble up in their consciousness. It's as if these people had awakened from a collective dream, and once awake, could no longer pretend they were still sleeping. Camus called this awakening to the absurd, the moment when we recognize that our lives are simultaneously infinitely precious and apparently without a predefined cosmic purpose. The French philosopher understood that this discovery, far from being a tragedy, can be the beginning of true freedom. But on the path to this freedom, there exists a painful transition period where we feel uprooted from everything that once gave us identity and belonging. When you can no longer genuinely get excited about the small victories that move your co-workers, when family discussions about problems that seem superficial to you become exercises in patience, when you realize you're constantly translating your thoughts and feelings into a language others can understand, you experience a very particular form of exile. It's not geographical exile, but the existential exile of those who inhabit a territory of consciousness that few others have visited. Median society, with its need to maintain the functioning of collective structures, develops a kind of natural resistance to those who question too much. It's not malice, it's self-preservation. A society cannot allow all its members to simultaneously question the foundations of existence, because this would paralyze the basic functioning of community life. Therefore, we develop social mechanisms that discourage questioning that goes too deep. Phrases like "be more practical," "stop thinking so much, you're complicating something simple," are well-intentioned attempts to bring back to the flock those who began to stray too far from shared certainties. The problem is that, for those who have truly gone far in the journey of self-knowledge, going back is no longer a viable option. This is where Camus' philosophy becomes an emotional life preserver. He doesn't offer us false promises that loneliness will disappear, or that we'll easily find our tribe of thought. Instead, he teaches us that we can transform this loneliness from a burden into a source of authenticity and strength. The Camusian concept of revolt is not revolt against specific people, but revolt against the temptation to accept easy answers when we know the questions are complex. It's the refusal to pretend we don't see what we see, that we don't feel what we feel, just to fit better into social expectations. This revolt is, paradoxically, an act of love both for ourselves and for humanity, because we choose to honor the truth of our experience instead of betraying it for convenience. The loneliness of those who go too far also carries a peculiar temporal dimension. While median society lives predominantly in the immediate present, focused on solving practical problems and achieving short and medium-term goals, those who have plunged deep into existential questions begin to inhabit multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. You ask yourself not only about what to do today, but about what it means to be alive at this specific moment in human history, about how your choices echo in eternity, about what emotional and spiritual legacy you're building through each apparently insignificant decision. This expansion of temporal consciousness creates a mismatch with those who live more linearly, more focused on the next deadline, the next goal, the next problem to solve. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of this loneliness is the responsibility it brings. When you see further, when you understand patterns that others haven't yet perceived, when your sensitivity captures nuances that go unnoticed by most, you become, in a way, responsible for this expanded vision. Camus spoke about the responsibility of the revolted man, one who, having recognized the absurd, chooses to live with integrity even knowing there are no cosmic guarantees that his actions have ultimate meaning. It's as if you were a translator between worlds, someone who needs to find ways to communicate profound insights in a manner that's useful and accessible to those who haven't yet made the same journey. There's also a dimension of grief in this loneliness that's rarely recognized. When you go too far, you inevitably lose previous versions of yourself that were more compatible with the world around you. There's a symbolic death of the person you were when you could satisfy yourself with simple explanations, when you could find complete happiness in the same things that satisfy most people. This loss is real and deserves to be honored, even though the transformation that caused it is ultimately a positive expansion of consciousness. It's as if you were a traveler who can no longer return home because your home no longer exists in the same way it existed before the journey. The physical place may be the same, but you've changed so much that the feeling of belonging has been lost. Camus offers us a comforting perspective when he suggests that the loneliness of the absurd man doesn't need to be a permanent condition of isolation, but can transform into a very particular form of solidarity. When we recognize that all human beings are fundamentally navigating existence without a guaranteed cosmic map, when we perceive that the absurd condition is universal, even though not everyone recognizes it consciously, we begin to develop a profound compassion for all humanity. This compassion isn't born from pity, but from the recognition that we're all in the same existential boat, some just with more awareness of the fact that the boat has no predetermined destination. Have you ever stopped to think about how liberating it is to realize that your loneliness isn't a personal defect, but a natural consequence of your courage to question? Share in the comments if you too have felt isolated for thinking differently from the majority. Write "I feel this too" if this description resonates with your experience. Your response not only validates your own journey, but helps other people recognize they're not alone in this process of consciousness expansion. Sometimes knowing that others have gone through or are going through the same process is the first step to transforming loneliness into communion. From this understanding, loneliness can begin to transform into something different. It doesn't disappear completely, but acquires a new quality. It becomes less a painful absence and more a rich presence, a broad interior space where you can dwell with dignity and purpose. It's as if you discovered that, although you may not have many travel companions on the same specific road you chose to travel, you developed a deeper and more honest relationship with yourself. This interior relationship becomes an inexhaustible resource of strength, creativity, and insight that you can offer to the world in unique and valuable ways. The loneliness of those who go too far also develops a contemplative quality that distinguishes it from common loneliness. It's not just being alone, it's being alone with purpose, with consciousness, with acceptance. It's learning to savor moments of interior silence not as voids to be filled, but as sacred spaces where your spirit can breathe and expand. Camus had an almost romantic relationship with this form of conscious loneliness, seeing it as a necessary condition for authentic creation and for the development of a genuine personal philosophy, not borrowed or imitated, but forged in the furnace of your own lived experience. What makes this journey even more interesting is realizing that although you may feel isolated by your perspectives, you are in fact participating in a millennial tradition of seekers, thinkers, artists and philosophers who made similar journeys throughout human history. Camus is part of this lineage, as well as Sartre, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and countless others who dared to look at life head-on without looking away. When you recognize that your loneliness connects you to this tradition of intellectual and emotional courage, it becomes less an isolation and more a form of spiritual belonging to a community that transcends time and space. As you learn to inhabit this loneliness with more comfort, you discover that it becomes a natural filter for relationships and experiences. Instead of trying to fit into spaces that don't accommodate your true nature, you begin to attract and be attracted to people and situations that honor your depth. Relationships become less numerous, perhaps, but infinitely more meaningful. Conversations become rarer, but when they happen, they have the weight and richness of true encounters between souls that recognize each other. It's as if your loneliness functioned as a kind of beacon, signaling to other solitary travelers that there's someone here who understands the journey. This transformation of loneliness into creative resource is perhaps one of the most beautiful aspects of Camusian philosophy. When you stop fighting against your condition as an existential outsider and begin to embrace it as a source of unique perspective, you discover that you have things to offer the world that only someone who made your particular journey could offer. Your art, your work, your relationships, your way of being present in life, all of this carries an authenticity and depth that wouldn't be possible if you had remained in the comfort zone of social mediocrity. Loneliness becomes then not a price you pay for thinking differently, but an essential ingredient in the recipe for a life that's truly yours. Camus reminds us that the absurd man, one who recognized the human condition in all its bewildering complexity, is not condemned to despair. On the contrary, he is liberated to create his own values, to choose his own battles, to love more intensely, precisely because he recognizes the precariousness and preciousness of existence. The loneliness of those who go too far is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a more authentic, more courageous, more genuinely yours narrative. If you've made it this far, you probably recognize something of your own journey in these reflections. Perhaps it's time to consider subscribing to this channel, not because you need more content to consume, but because sometimes we need reminders that there are other travelers on this less traveled road. This space was created for people like you, who don't fear difficult questions and who understand that some loneliness is sacred. Your presence here is an act of courage and deserves to be celebrated. In the end, the loneliness of those who go too far in a median society is not a curse but a revelation. It's the discovery that you're capable of more depth, more authenticity, more courage than most people imagine is possible. It's the recognition that your inner life is rich enough to sustain you, even when the outer world seems to offer little spiritual nourishment. It's the understanding that, although there may be few travel companions on your specific road, you've developed internal resources that make the journey not only bearable, but deeply meaningful. Camus teaches us that we can transform our existential loneliness into a form of creative rebellion against superficiality, into a celebration of human depth, into a courageous affirmation that life is worth living even when, or especially when, we don't have all the answers. Loneliness ceases to be a void to be filled and becomes a space to be inhabited with dignity, purpose, and a strange form of joy that only those who truly know their own soul can understand.